Hi everyone, this is AC7WH. On this video I would like to talk about how much of a difference, or perhaps not so much of a difference, the power level or the antenna gain will actually make with the received signal on the other end. So I would like to start with an example here. And this example is related to if you are going to increase the S meter reading on the received signal with the other radio. In other words, if I were to transmit a signal to someone else and they receive me as an S1, what would it take for them to receive me as an S3? How many decibels of gain and how much power increase is this going to take? Well, I will include some links here in the description. And yes, I am going to be using Wikipedia, as you can see on my screen here. However, I wouldn't say that Wikipedia is the all-around absolute best final authority by any means on amateur radio. However, it is nice as a quick reference, and then you can dive deeper for further references and so forth. All right, so back to the example. Going from an S1 to an S3 for the received signal based on what I'm transmitting. All right, let's say I have a typical basic antenna, and I am putting out the usual 100 watts, and that is presenting a signal of S1 on the other end, and hopefully there is no noise interfering. Let's say the noise is at a level of 0, just hypothetically. It doesn't have to be in this example, but let's just say that. So the S1 is certainly enough to hear me, but it's not like it's a strong signal by any means. All right. So if I want to move up to an S3, then I would need to definitely increase my power. Now, if you know how many decibels are represented by each S meter number, then you're already a step ahead of many people, I would suspect. And I did not remember this at first and had to relearn what the designation is for how many decibels per S unit. All right, well, it turns out that each S unit is much more power differential than I would have guessed. So before I reveal some of these key numbers, although of course you can look it up or you can read it here on this page and get an idea, I'm going to give a quick quiz to be thinking about this for a few moments. If I wanted to go from an S1 to an S3, in my example of using 100 watts, do you think that A, I would need to increase my power from 100 up to 400 watts, B, up to 800 watts, or C, up to 1600 watts? Think about it for a moment, just from what you know. Maybe you'll be looking this up. All right, I would have to increase the power to 1600 watts, and I'll tell you why here. Now, keep in mind, obviously, the legal limit here in the United States is 1500 watts. So, by just increasing power alone without any changes to the transmission line or the antenna, or any change on the other end to the receiving antenna or any kind of preamplifier, without changing anything else, just changing the transmitter output power with an amplifier, I would have to theoretically increase to 1600 watts. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at our numbers here. So, reading off of this Wikipedia page, the International Amateur Radio Union, IARU Region 1, agreed on a technical recommendation for S-meter calibration for HF and VHF UHF transceivers in 1981. Now, I know there are multiple regions of the IARU. However, this has come to be widely adopted in all regions from what I have found. But in 1981, that was a great year, by the way. This would have been around the time I was born and close to the time that I first started becoming interested and fascinated in amateur radio because of my father, who had assembled a Heathkit HW8, the Morse code transceiver, QRP transceiver. He had assembled that from the kit, from Heathkit, right around this time. Well, in any case, in 1981, the groundwork was laid so that the recommendation defines that a difference of 1 S unit corresponds to a difference of 6 decibels, equivalent to a voltage ratio of 2, or, for the purpose of our video here, we're focusing on power, a power ratio of 4. Now, this can be explored further by looking more on this Wikipedia page, but also I am going to point out something here with decibels. On the decibel page of Wikipedia, again, links in the description, a 6 decibel increase, which again, 6 decibels is what was determined for 1 S unit on the S meter. That is roughly equivalent to a 4 times increase. Or if you're going down, obviously that would be a decrease. So that's for 1. Now, keep in mind, if you wanted 2, you would S meter places increased. You would need to go another 4 times on top of that. So 4 times 4 is obviously 16. Well, the correct answer, if anybody guessed it or calculated it or knew this answer off the top of your head, it would take 1600 watts, hypothetically, to go from an S1 to an S3. If I started out with 100 watts, I'd have to go to 1600 watts if nothing else changed. So, as you can imagine, some of these expensive amplifiers or expensive, costly antennas may not make as much of a difference as you suspect. However, one thing that I have learned and studied is that if you are in a pileup and there is a very strong station that comes through and the automatic gain control of the receiving station is automatically compensating for that strong station, it may compensate to the point that it eliminates your signal unless you are a little bit closer in the strength of your signal versus that really strong, powerful station. So there is an advantage there to not get eliminated. And of course, if the noise level is higher and you need to pull out of that noise, maybe the noise level is an S1 or S2 and you need to go at least a little bit above that and hit something at least closer to an S3, well, then that little bit of movement on the S meter can be the difference between making a contact and totally missing it that time. So those are some factors to keep in mind, but let's dive a little bit deeper. So if we look back here at the IARU Region 1 technical recommendation, 1 S unit corresponds to a signal level difference of 6 decibels like we just discussed. And then there are more technical specifications here for this standardization. Now, there is another page here that I will link in the description for a calculator. So let's take a look here. This will reinforce what we've been talking about. If we have an input of 100 watts, this is with the power scale here selected with the little power radio button, and we are changing to 1600 watts for the output. Let's see what the difference is in decibels. That would be roughly speaking, 12 decibels. And remember, for every 6 decibels, that's 1 S unit. So that would be 6 times 2 is 12. That would be 2 S units. Let's do this another way here. So if we need there to be an increase in 12 decibels for those 2 S units, and we are looking at how much more energy, how much more power we need here, we would be needing roughly 16 times, so 15.8489 and so forth. So rounded off, 16 times as much power, hence the 1600 theoretical watts. All right, now something else to keep in mind when it comes to antennas, I will touch on just briefly here, and that is that if you were to get an antenna that is going to give you this increase, keep in mind that you need to figure out what antenna you were starting with. That may seem obvious, but it can easily be overlooked. So a dipole antenna at the ideal height is going to have a gain compared to the theoretical isotropic radiator. It's going to have a gain of about 2.15 decibels over an isotropic radiator. So what that means is if you need 12 more decibels compared to that dipole that you already have, hypothetically, then you would need a gain of more like 14 decibels over an isotropic radiator or 12 decibels over that dipole. Keep in mind you will not get that gain unless you are up above ground at a reasonable height, and you can find detailed calculations, but something like half a wavelength is one example. In other cases, you may see an entire whole wavelength is the recommendation to achieve the gain that is stated for a certain advertised antenna, for example. And even a bare minimum per se might be a quarter wavelength. Well, depending on what band you're using, if you're using like the 40-meter band, for example, a quarter of a wavelength would be 10 meters, which is going to be already a little bit on the high side. But if you're doing half a wavelength or 20 meters on that 40-meter band, you're looking at a very high mast, possibly an antenna tower, and so forth. So if you think of all the costs that would go into getting the antenna, the mast, the antenna tower, the supports, and the foundation, and all of that, that's going to add up to an extremely high cost just to be able to say that my signal is 2 S units stronger. So I'm getting an S3 for my signal report to that distant DX station versus an S1, or I'm getting an S7 instead of an S5, or whatever, or an S9 maybe instead of an S7. So yes, it can make differences in those pileups and in the high noise situations, but it may not seem as worth it to you in the long run. Now, I do recommend checking out a YouTube channel that provides some excellent myth-busting information for ham radio operators. And I also recommend, again, check out those links in the description, as well as the rest of the videos that I have on my channel. Thank you so much, everyone, and 73.